Because in actuality, if the Sturmgewehr had been sort of brought in when it was first presented to him, it could have been present in some decisive battles, and the war could have gone differently. Now, that would have been bad for us, naturally. But again, him, Adolf, as the leader, dumb decision to turn that down. Well, like a lot of the brighter decisions made by Germany at the time, the developers went over his head. You know, smart. I mean, not in the sense that you're probably going to incur the wrath of a raging psychopath. But the developers went over his head, and they decided to release the weapon in limited numbers to... Okay, hang on. Okay, so... Gun rocket, I decided, like, sniper cannon. So then we're supposed to have, like... rocket gun. Got it. Can I even build a rocket? So they developed it in limited numbers because, of course, they didn't have the government's support at that point because he basically gave them a no thanks. A hard pass on that. But they made it because they're like, you know what, we're on to something, and he doesn't disagree, so we'll show him. And it's not the first time where management has tried to shut something down and some, like, plucky engineers decided, well, you know what, they're wrong, we're right, and we're going to do it anyway. So the weapons went out, and I guess the story, and we are kind of talking about, like, Apocrypha here, the story sort of went that he was patrolling the front to sort of inspire the men, whatever, and saw some soldiers equipped with the weapon that he had remembered. He told them, like, no, we're not going to formally adopt it, and he had the, like, wisdom to ask them, that gun, what is it called? They're like, it's the MP44. He's like, okay, is it good? You know, how does it work? And the guys basically told them that apart from, like, machine gun rolls, the weapon never left them with want of another weapon, because there was never a target conventionally, like, obviously some targets you'd need a sniper to do it, but there was never a target that they'd conventionally encounter that they could not accurately hit, and there was never an environment too cramped or, you know, whatever for them to be able to maneuver with the weapon. On top of that, if you got several of them firing together, it was as good as having a machine gun. Like, again, the new weapon left them with no want of another weapon. And the thing is, like, Germany was really in the lurch at this point, and one of the ideas about how they were going to beat their enemies, because at this point, Germany had picked a fight with the world. Literally, the entire world was on their case at this point. Well, those zombies did my job for me. Of course, they also killed a civilian. So, to help preserve morale, the story, such that it was that, okay, we are going to triumph because of the strength of our Wunderwaffen, our wonder weapons, because Germans are still known for the precision of their engineering. I mean, that's not even a stereotype, that's just true. And the idea was that they were going to create technological marvels and wonders that was going to win them the war. And this was more of a propaganda thing than anything that... I mean, it did create the Sturmgewehr and, like, the B-2 flying bomb and all that stuff, but for the most part, a lot of the so-called wonder weapons, the Wunderwaffen, flash in the pan, squib, accomplished nothing. Which was good for us. So, they wanted to rebrand this rifle, because it wasn't really a submachine gun, so the machine pistol designation was inaccurate. They wanted to rebrand it, and they wanted it to be an ominous name associated with the sort of German military doctrine. And back in World War I, the guys who sort of did the most damage on behalf of Germany were the Sturmtruppen, the Stormtroopers. And yes, the Star Wars term derives from the German Stormtroopers. And in that case, storm is not meant to reference weather, it's meant to reference an assault, like how you would storm a castle. Have fun storming a castle. And the idea was that they were going to call the rifle the Sturmgewehr, the storm rifle, as in a rifle that a stormtrooper, the elite of the elite, would use. And so it gets rebranded. Functionally, it was the exact same thing. Like, there's no difference there. There's supposed to be 3 workers. And the weapon was game-changing, because, I mean, today, when we think of, like, what is a soldier's standard arms, the thing that usually comes to mind is an assault rifle, because, yes, exactly, that's exactly what it is.
I'm right behind you.
I'm detecting a secret, and I can't find it. So the issue was that the Mauser company had quite the run of bad luck, because they kept competing for new weapon designs, because even though the rifle being used as the standard by Germany at the time was one of their designs, it was, at that point, generously surplused, which meant there was no need for new stock. Mauser was missing the wartime cash cow, the money wagon. So they put in this effort of, okay, we'll try making a semi-auto rifle, because the Americans have one of those, and it seems to work. They were beaten out by Walther. Then they're like, okay, well then we'll make this new machine-gun carbiner. And then they were beaten out by Heinel. So they're just like, can we, like, put something together that will impress? So the problem is all the sort of weapon roles that you might have a particular need for have been filled at this point, which is a problem for Mauser, because they still need to manufacture something to profit off of the war, because, you know, companies and corporations are going to do what companies and corporations do. They're going to make money, even if it's on the back of the blood of their countrymen. So they put forth a prototype project called the Girat 06, which was an attempt at making a Sturmgewehr that was cheaper. At least in theory.
Get out of here.
Now, they technically were able to save half of the price. No. Initially, they were able to save a quarter of the price off of the normal Sturmgewehr by switching to, like, roller locking and receiver design changes that allowed it to be stamped. And what we got, and the thing is, they approached, you know, the powers that be in Germany at the time with that, and they were told, again, kind of a no thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. The reason was because, like, we just finished tooling the factories to make the Sturmgewehr as is. And our overall losses for having to retool the factory now to make this new version, however cheaper it may be, it just doesn't justify itself. So they went back to... So one of the problems they encountered, and this is an issue with roller-locked designs, was that the rollers could bounce back, and then the weapon could discharge with the bolt out of battery, which basically means there's a tiny explosion in your gun that you don't want to have happen. The thing is, they'd noticed that there was a way they could appropriate this problem to enable the weapon to function without a gas system, and what they had created, in effect, was roller-delayed blowback operation. Further receiver tweaks and the implementation of this operating system instead of a gas system made the design even cheaper. And the result is that they went there with a Girat 06H, which H, I guess, was for half-locked, even though by our modern nomenclature it wasn't locked at all, because it's blowback operated. And now they were saving half the price in the Sturmgewehr, and the powers that be were like, okay, that sort of justifies what you're offering. Until I capture the factory, I won't have... There's no... The shelter isn't here. So I have to capture the factory for that. Okay. +7 per day. Yikes. Okay, we got, like, a bunch. Okay, well, here's the problem. I could afford the shelter upgrade down here now, and actually have this not accrue so much threat so quickly. I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to develop this zone more. Problem is, everything has expense now, too, so the money I'm earning is a lot of it's probably actually going just to sustaining what I have. We need more factories, but the first zone is completely pointless for that, yet again, because there are no factories in the first zone. Gonna up our defenses here. That's an expensive chunk of cheddar. Not even gonna, like, fully diminish the threat in the zone either, because these guys are now deadlier than I am, because I cannot afford to upgrade these zones and them, and I'm trying to automate as much of this as possible so I'm not busting my ass trying to get work done. Oh, you're a gun-toting zombie. So the Gerado 6H was eventually going to be produced as the Sturmgewehr 45, as in model of 1945. Well, if you know your wartime history, you know the war ended in 1945, and the issue was a lot of those Mauser STG-45 prototype parts were thrown on trains, and they were supposed to be delivered to the sort of Austrian mountains, where the German officials were going to, like, continue the war effort in exile. None of this happened, ultimately. The issue is the Mauser engineers who developed it were, you know, firearms engineers by trade, and part of Germany's agreement to surrender was that they not produce more arms for a while. You know, you don't want the guys who just defeated to, I don't know, rise up and create more problems. So those engineers would, of course, have been out of a job had they stayed in Germany, so they went to Spain for a while. And, you know, technically the beginning of the G3 was in the Setme Institute and the Spanish Setme rifle. And that design was functionally a modernization of that STG-45M Mauser version. So, meanwhile, we have Heckler & Koch, who it's generally held probably always intended to get into firearms design, but started as precision machine manufacturers for things like sewing machines, because there you've got a lot of small parts that need to endure significant stresses. And it was a good way of earning steady income during a rebuilding period when firearms just couldn't be made in-country. However, once the whole ban on Germany's expansion of its arsenal had been lifted, those Mauser engineers returned to the homeland and immediately sought employment with, like, one of the premier firms, machine firms, in the country, and that was Heckler & Koch. So what they presented became the Gewehr 3. Why 3, I do not know. And the G3 rifle was in the new 30 caliber NATO cartridge, and it used the roller-delayed blowback, and it was effectively a modernization of the Sturmgewehr, the first assault rifle. Even though, interestingly, the G3 is technically a battle rifle, because assault rifles, by definition, use a cartridge between a rifle and a pistol cartridge, but the 30 caliber American, or the 30 caliber NATO, the 7.62, is technically a rifle cartridge, even though it was originally conceived as an intermediate cartridge. I mean, that's a whole different story. I've probably been going on about the history of the MP5 for like 3 videos now, probably the past hour. Beneficially for those of you who are disinterested in guns or just annoyed at the fact that I've just been going on about something that relates only tangentially to the game that I'm playing, the story is rounding off. So the thing was, the engineers behind the G3 had this mindset of, this system is potentially infinitely scalable. You know, we could make it fire something bigger. We could make it fire something smaller. We could make it fire something a lot smaller. And there's a G3 variant in probably every major caliber, rifle caliber or assault rifle caliber. And critically, one of those variants you'll be familiar with was the MP5. So while the MP5 is ubiquitous for its usage in games and film, it is technically a variant of a post-war heavy rifle, a battle rifle, converted caliber-wise for a pistol cartridge. Now, why does the MP5 get so much press? Well, there was the hostage crisis. I don't remember which hostage crisis, but basically the British SAS, I think it was like Iranian embassy or something. When they hit the place, they had to decide what weapon they were going to use. They were like, okay, it's going to be close quarters. We need suppressive firepower in a compact package that gives us all necessary maneuverability. And what occurred to them was, okay, our best choice for that will be a submachine gun. But we need a submachine gun with a high degree of user-friendliness and precision, durability, and reliability. And they went for the MP5, and of course that raid was like televised later, and you know, the good guys, if you will, or the lawful type in games are almost always toting that MP5 because it became this sort of symbol of elite paramilitary civil forces. And from there, of course, it finds its way into movies, finds its way into video games from movies. Usually stuff started in movies before video games, because movies did come first. And now the MP5 has become this ubiquitous, almost household name, at least insofar as gaming and gamers are concerned. I think the clearance mission has our master and... because oh no, I didn't do the factory capture yet. That threat is getting a little spicy, so I think it's going to be a clearance mission first. Why do I have mail? There we go. Okay, well, I guess it's going to be direct action then. Could we even upgrade this? If I want rocket turrets, it's going to cost me 2 soldiers. Now, there's another reason to go for the anti-tank gun, or the cannon, as it once was. Because it's cheaper, actually. It only takes 1 soldier, whereas the rocket takes 2. I know the rocket deals heavy damage, but the travel rate and the rate of fire does not justify it. Then there's just price point. Oh no, the cannon is actually more expensive money-wise than the rocket, but honestly, the money you can generate, the soldiers you can't. The soldiers you have to grind for. And then we got shit like this where I need engineers and builders just to manufacture a gate. And 2 engineers for a flamethrower. Great. Alright, let's take stock of the situation. So yeah, to round off what I've been saying is that, yeah, the MP5 has a history dating back to the Second World War, and like I said, a lot of weapons we use today do date back to the Second World War. That's just how things are. That's how it works. I mean, generally, if it doesn't date to the Second World War, it'll date to the First World War. And I mean, you've got modern conveniences like GPS, which actually started as a military technology. We used it in Desert Saber. You know, it astonishes me that, like, Desert Saber is becoming a dated reference. Of course, a lot of people are like, what was Desert Saber? And it's like, well, most people are familiar with Operation Desert Storm. So, another interesting historical anecdote. You have Iraq, a country that's sort of well established in the public consciousness here in the West these days, if not the world over. Iraq at the time had a big military, largely sponsored from, like, Soviet surplus, probably sourced from Afghanistan after they were forced to abandon it, because yes, the Soviets occupied Afghanistan. If you've played Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, you'll have been made familiar with that fact if you weren't already. In many ways, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was like it was basically the Soviet Vietnam. Because in the same sense that we had regular army deployed in Vietnam and they were constantly being harassed by insurgents, the Soviets had regular army in Afghanistan and they were constantly being harassed by insurgents. So yes, Afghanistan was like the Soviets' Vietnam. The problem is, when they left a bunch of their toys behind, and a bunch of warlords and arms dealers and so forth, you know, help themselves, as they often do. And so you've got a lot of Soviet-era, like, wartime machinery. Everything from machine guns to tanks to rocket launchers just sitting around the Middle East. And guys like Saddam Hussein appropriated as much of it as they could afford, because how exactly are you going to oppress the populace and be a dictator if you don't have a formidable army that is formidably equipped? The issue was Iraq had a lot of bang. They did not have a lot of money. It's always been like a failed state. And so the issue was, here's Kuwait, their neighbor, that probably a lot of people today haven't heard of because it's not one of those like hotspots of sedition and terrorism, at least not so far as I know. There's Kuwait, their neighbor, and the Kuwait army leaves something to be desired. But they're rich. They have a big national treasury. They actually have, you know, a sort of developed civilization and business and commerce and all sorts of cool stuff. So Iraq is like, we got a lot of guns and not a lot of money, and they have a lot of money and not a lot of guns. Now, an entrepreneurial type might think that maybe we can work out some kind of, you know, rent army loan deal, but the Iraqis instead decide to be less entrepreneurial and more assholes. And they're like, okay, we're just going to invade Kuwait. We're just going to go in, and we're going to just take over the country. And we're going to empty all of their banks, we're going to empty all their treasuries. We're going to take their money. So, the international community was not happy about this. Then, of course, Iraq started, like, threatening oil reserves and so forth, which was probably a big portion of Kuwait's wealth. And naturally, we can't have that here in the West. However, will we have cheap gasoline? So, an international force of, like, US, UK forces, it was nice to see us playing nicely a while ago. A force of US and UK forces go into Kuwait to get the Iraqis out of the country. That was Operation Desert Storm. Now, the thing is, we would subsequently invade Iraq. You know, not the post-9/11 invasion of Iraq. This was before that. We would subsequently invade Iraq because it wasn't enough to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We decided that he needs to be deposed from power. We did not obviously commit to that notion because we would end up invading there again and deposing him from power, I suppose, second time's the charm. But that was not part of Operation Desert Storm. That was Operation Desert Saber.